Welcome to Sunshine Lost, a series focusing on individuals who disappeared throughout the state of Florida. I'm your host, Benjamin Thomas. Amy Billig was born on January 9, 1957, to mother Susan Billig and father Nathaniel Ned Billig. Amy's mother Susan had 4 miscarriages before giving birth to Amy and described Amy as her miracle. Amy's hobbies included playing the guitar and the flute. Amy was a volunteer with the Dolphin Project on Key Biscayne, a program dedicated to rehabilitating dolphins and releasing them back into the ocean. Amy was also a vegetarian. She enjoyed writing poetry, reading books, and acting. In fact, she considered pursuing an acting career. In later years, her brother Josh would describe her, quote, "She was just sort of a young, kind of hippie-ish girl," end quote. On March 5, 1974, 17-year-old Amy arrived home after school. She had a quick yogurt snack, then left her home and started walking toward her parents' art gallery they owned and operated in Coconut Grove. She wanted to go out with friends later that day for a late afternoon lunch, so she gave her father Ned a call to see if he would let her borrow $2, back when goods were more reasonably priced. He said sure, so Amy changed clothes and began walking toward her parents' art gallery. She was witnessed by several construction workers who recalled seeing her walking, then getting into a van located at the intersection of Poinciana Street and Main Highway. Amy often hitchhiked to get around town. Amy's mother Susan once said, quote, "In those days, everyone hitchhiked. I did, even if I was just going to the gallery. People trusted people," end quote. Because she frequently hitchhiked to get around town, it is believed that an unknown individual or individuals picked her up while she was walking. Concern mounted when Amy's friends called her house and asked why she never arrived for their late lunch hangout. Her father arrived home soon after and said she never stopped by to pick up the $2. Amy's parents then called the police, who said they can't move forward immediately, that they will need to call back the next morning if Amy doesn't show up. Susan gave the Miami Police Department a phone call at 6:00 a.m. the next morning, officially reporting her daughter missing. During the initial hours of the investigation, police learned that she had only a few personal possessions when she disappeared, leading them to believe that she went missing involuntarily. Amy's mother Susan promptly began searching for her daughter immediately upon the discovery that she was missing. The family searched for Amy themselves, as well as hiring a private investigator. In addition to police, Susan distributed hundreds of flyers throughout Miami-Dade County, which included the Billig's residence's telephone number for anyone who might have any information. The family did everything they possibly could to keep public interest in Amy's disappearance, including holding a number of news conferences. This somewhat paid off when, on March 10th, the first headlines regarding Amy appeared in the local newspapers, which included the theory that Amy was abducted by a motorcycle gang. The Pagans and Outlaws motorcycle gangs were known to travel through the Coconut Grove area during 1974. The Billig family offered a $1,000 reward, which led to a series of different tips. One such tip was received on March 16, 1974, from a woman calling herself Susan Johnson. She said that Amy was taken by the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. On the same day, a family friend of the Billig family called their residence to let them know that a lawyer had contacted them, saying that they had recently done some legal work for the Outlaws, and there were rumors going around that a teenage girl was abducted from somewhere in Miami. This family friend even convinced 2 members of the gang to visit the Billig family to get some information about Amy. One of the members told Amy's mother, Susan, that if Amy was with anyone in the Outlaws, she would be returned. A few days later, one of the 2 gang members called Susan and told her to, quote, "forget the whole thing," end quote. On March 18th, almost 2 weeks after Amy was last seen, her Instamatic camera was found in a grassy area of the Wildwood exit on Florida's Turnpike, which is located 250 miles northwest of Miami. A college man who was himself hitchhiking had located the camera and turned it into police after he heard Amy was missing. The Wildwood exit on Florida's Turnpike is significant because that would have been along the route both biker gangs would have taken when traveling north. Police and Amy's relatives don't know if Amy had the camera in her possession when she disappeared. It's possible she lost the camera before she went missing. Authorities had the film inside the camera developed, which unfortunately didn't provide many clues or suspects. In fact, most of the photos developed turned out to be completely overexposed, except for only 2 photos. One photo was a pickup truck parked in front of a building covered by vines. The police were unable to track down the pickup truck and were also unable to determine where this vine-covered building was. The other photograph, which contained a white van, was also not located by the police. Also on March 18, 1974, 16 days after Amy disappeared, the Billig family received a phone call from an unknown individual who claimed Amy was kidnapped and they demanded $30,000 for her return. Shortly after this call, Susan received another call from this unknown individual with someone's voice in the background who she believed to be Amy, who was frantically yelling, quote, "Mama, Mama, please," end quote. Susan, Amy's mother, gathered $30,000 in cash from friends of hers and agreed to meet the unknown man to deliver the money. They agreed on a time and location, the Fontainebleau Hotel, on March 22nd, where she will hand the money over in a black attaché case. Susan arrived and met the man who actually did show up, but since Amy wasn't with him, Susan refused to give him the money until he can prove he indeed had Amy. The unknown man hadn't realized the police were within the vicinity during this meeting, and he was promptly arrested on sight. The unknown man turned out to be one of 2 boys who put this scheme together, 16-year-old twin brothers by the name of Charles and Larry Glasser. After an investigation, it was determined that the Glasser twins not only had nothing to do with Amy's disappearance, they didn't even know Amy in the first place. They were subsequently charged and convicted of extortion. After this ordeal, Susan made a statement to the media saying, quote, "Please no more crank calls like that one. I would have done anything to get Amy back, begged, borrowed, or stolen," end quote. Little did Susan know this statement would lead to a long series of horrendous and sadistic phone calls that would last for over 2 decades. In June of 1974, 3 months after Amy disappeared, Susan received a phone call from a convenience store manager in Orlando that a young woman who he said looked just like Amy visited the store on a number of occasions to purchase vegetable soups and was accompanied by 2 bikers. Police thought this tip to be possibly credible because they did not release to the public that Amy was a vegetarian. As if Amy's mother Susan wasn't going through enough hell already, in 1974, 3 weeks after Amy disappeared, Susan began receiving harassing phone calls from a man who called himself Hal Johnson, which devolved into menacing phone calls and eventually torturous. The unknown caller started by informing Susan that he took Amy. He trained her as an adult exploit slave and sold her to a biker gang. Amy was kidnapped and was being used by members of an illegal explicit ring organization. He also told her that he cut out Amy's tongue, that she is being sold off at a livestock auction, that you will be abducted just like your daughter and sold into the slave trade. He would call over 7 times in a single night, and there were times he would only call once over a period of several months. This man would continue contacting Susan for the next 21 years because she refused to change her number in hopes that Amy would one day reach out with a call. She also thought in the back of her mind that perhaps this Hal character might really know where Amy was and perhaps one day he will finally tell her. Quote, "I would hang up often, but then I'd think, what if this man knows something about my child?" End quote. Fast forward to 1993. After Amy's father Ned passed away, Susan received another call from Hal, who said, quote, "Ned's dead, isn't he? You're alone now, aren't you? You better watch out," end quote. Police had repeatedly attempted to capture this man by tracing his phone calls, but the calls always led to a payphone, and he was long gone every time the police arrived. In early October of 1995, this Hal character decided to place a series of intensely harassing calls to Susan, who was able to record these phone calls with a judge's approval. Some of what he said included, quote, "Amy was sold to a motorcycle gang and was taken to Canada. From Canada, she was unloaded in London. Once trained, she was sold to ragheads in Saudi Arabia," end quote. He even went as far as to say, quote, "I have a special request. I want you and her together," end quote. Hal eventually purchased an untraceable cell phone, believing he will remain one step ahead of law enforcement. But on October 21, 1995, detectives, armed with new state-of-the-art telephone equipment, were able to pinpoint Hal's phone to the U.S. Customs Department in Miami. Detectives paid a visit to the U.S. Customs Office with recordings of the caller's voice in hand, and they played the tapes for customs officials who were able to identify the voice as belonging to Henry Johnson Blair, age 48, a decorated U.S. Customs special agent of 24 years. Of course, he denied his involvement at first, until he heard his own voice on the tapes and subsequently confessed during the interview. When Henry was interrogated by the FBI, he admitted to harassing Susan, but for no longer than 18 months. He blamed his actions on his alcoholism and that he had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, made worse by his stress of his everyday job, which he credited his OCD as his reason for contacting Susan repeatedly over the years. He insisted to authorities that they were just crank calls and that he would never act out on his verbal threats. He said the pressure of his job would mount, and he would make a call to Susan, and then the pressure would subside. He also maintained that he never met Amy and that he knew nothing about her disappearance, which obviously didn't make sense, given that he described Amy as being a victim in the explicit trade industry. While awaiting trial, he was evaluated by a psychologist, Sonia Ruiz, who described Henry as deeply troubled. He had frequent crying spells and maintained suicidal ideation. Henry was charged with 3 counts of aggravated stalking for harassing Susan. He pleaded not guilty and was freed on $75,000 bond. On November 17, 1995, Henry appeared for his bond hearing, where Susan laid eyes on the man for the first time. She recalled, quote, "There was mostly disgust. He looked like your ordinary next-door neighbor. I wondered, how could he do this to me? This man with a wife and 2 girls," end quote. Henry's friends, relatives, and work colleagues came to his defense. They described him as a guy who drives an everyday, fuel-efficient Honda, a man who lives in a condo in Kendall with his 2 daughters and his wife Cynthia, who worked as a hospital administrator, and whom he coincidentally married 2 weeks before Amy's abduction. One of the agents Henry worked with in Miami said, quote, "Hank is one of the most down-to-earth, commonsensical, likable people you would ever meet," end quote. Henry was on the managerial level, supervising 17 agents in his office. He most notably aided in the recovery of a painting that was stolen from a Spanish museum, painted by Peter Paul Rubens in 1636. His recovery of the painting earned him Spain's highest civilian honor. In the end, he was obviously fired from his career as a U.S. Customs special agent and was sentenced to a prison term of 2 years and has long since been released. Susan decided to sue Henry in civil court, and the case was settled in the amount of $5 million. According to Susan, she didn't receive a single harassing phone call after Henry's arrest. According to Amy's brother Josh, Henry made just 2 annual payments of $10,000 toward his $5 million settlement before his death. Rewinding back to January of 1976, we continue with the next lead. Amy's mother Susan received a phone call from a man in Oklahoma by the name of David, who claimed he was a motorcycle gang member and said he saw Amy's picture in the newspaper, who he recognized as a girl he used to quote-unquote own. The man agreed to travel down to Coconut Grove, Florida from Oklahoma to meet with Susan at the family home. After he arrived, he explained to Amy's mother and father that Amy was quiet, like a mute, very timid and submissive. He also described a scar Amy had, which the media was never told about. During their discussion, David said he would reach out to the individual who currently had Amy in his possession. He seemingly followed through with this promise because, after he returned to Oklahoma, he did give Susan a phone call, letting her know that Amy was in Tulsa. Susan promptly made her way up to Tulsa and met with David at a local tavern where Amy was supposed to be reunited with her mother. But for some reason, while at the tavern, David got into a fight with other gang members who ended up injuring him. While all this was going on, another gang member hurried Susan outside and put her into a taxi. Not knowing what else to do, Susan headed back home to Florida. In late February or early March of 1976, Susan received another phone call from David. He explained to her that the fight broke out because the gang believed he was an informant. He claimed they broke his kneecaps and he was in recovery. He also added that Amy was now in Seattle and working as an exotic dancer in a bar he didn't name. To make matters more ominous, David told Susan that this would be the last time he would ever call her. He didn't say why, but it can be assumed that the gang threatened him to leave it alone, or else. Susan did make the 3,000-mile trip up to Seattle. While in Seattle, Susan searched for Amy in a number of different bars, taverns, clubs, and exotic dancer establishments. She also visited the pagan motorcycle gang's headquarters in Seattle, hoping to get any information she possibly could regarding Amy's whereabouts. Despite her frantic search all over Seattle, she was unable to find Amy. For years and years, Susan traveled and interviewed many numbers of bikers in establishments, in bars, and even in prisons around the country, hoping that just one had credible information about what happened to Amy and if she still might be alive. Sometime during the late 1970s, a man by the name of Paul Branch, who was a member of the Pagans motorcycle gang at the time, contacted Susan. He informed her that Amy was still alive and currently being held by pagan members. However, during the late 1990s, Paul's widow contacted Susan and told Susan that Paul told her on his deathbed that Amy was brought to a party that was put on by the pagan motorcycle gang on the night of her disappearance and that she had died of a drug overdose while there. The gang decided to dispose of her in the Florida Everglades by tossing her body to alligators. Detective Jack Culver recalled this interview, quote, "They drugged her with heroin and they raped her, and then they kept pumping drugs into her system and she overdosed. They decided to chop up and throw her out into the Everglades," end quote. Fast forward to August of 1985. A man by the name of Alex Corvier made a call to a police department in Pennsylvania, informing them that he saw a picture of Amy on a flyer and said he knew her as a woman named Terry Ann Warner. He told them that Terry died back in 1974 in the state of Texas, and her body was never claimed. A Miami detective decided to follow up on this lead and, accompanied by a dentist from Miami, made a trip up to Vernon, Texas. The detective was successful in getting the body exhumed for examination. The dentist compared the body's teeth with Amy's dental records and determined that it was not Amy Billig. Needless to say, Amy's parents were quite relieved and held out hope that Amy was still alive somewhere. Amy kept a journal, which turned the focus of the investigation into yet another direction. Amy wrote in her journal that she wanted to run away with a man to South America. The man she named in her journal was Hank. Remember Henry Johnson Blair? Well, his nickname is also Hank, which makes for an awful big coincidence. Friends and relatives of Amy said they don't believe Amy knew anyone by the name of Hank, nor do they think she would have had an opportunity to have met Henry. One of the photographs developed from the roll inside Amy's camera showed a white van. At the time, police didn't believe this van was of any significance, but after digging into Henry's past, they discovered that he owned a white van, which was the exact model van seen in the photograph from Amy's camera. Another big coincidence was that the U.S. Customs Department relocated Henry on numerous assignments to South America during the 1970s, where he worked as a sky marshal and an undercover agent on commercial airlines in the event that a hijacking might occur. Henry and his wife got married just a couple weeks before Amy disappeared. They went on a honeymoon to San Francisco and then returned to South Florida within days of Amy's disappearance. Despite these coincidences being substantially suspicious, police have been unable to tie any direct evidence from Amy's disappearance to Henry. Fast forward to 1998. The television channel A&E produced a documentary about Amy's disappearance. During the production of this documentary, Paul Branch's widow reached out to Susan about Amy's disappearance, and the television producers recorded their encounter. Paul's wife gave Susan the story about her husband Paul's deathbed confession about Amy overdosing on drugs during a pagan motorcycle gang party the night she disappeared, and her body being disposed of in the Everglades. Some detectives believed Paul's widow was telling the truth, while others believed she was lying and only told this story in an attempt to financially benefit from the A&E documentary. Susan, on the other hand, accepted the story given by Paul's widow as the truth on the documentary at the time. Amy's father died from lung cancer in 1993 at the age of 69. Amy's mother, Susan, sadly passed away, also from lung cancer, in 2005 at the age of 80, after searching for her daughter for over 31 years, without ever knowing what happened to Amy. Before Susan passed away, she asked her son, Amy's brother, to never give up the search for Amy. When talking about the memory of his sister Amy, Josh Billig said, quote, "She was beautiful, although she did not yet know it. She was warm and talented. She wrote playful, pretty poetry, dabbled in watercolors, excelled at the flute and guitar. She was a practicing vegetarian, a budding feminist, and a voracious reader. She loved Sylvia Plath, Chinese food, clothes from secondhand stores, babies, little children, and her family." End quote. Amy is described as a Caucasian female with brown hair and brown eyes. She was last seen wearing a denim miniskirt and cork platform sandals. Amy has a 2-inch scar on her abdomen from an appendectomy procedure. She may also have a tattoo, but it's unknown what the tattoo might be. She also has a high-stepping gait. She was 5 feet 5 inches tall and 110 pounds around the time she disappeared. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Amy Billig, please call the Miami-Dade Crime Stoppers line at 305-471-8477. You may also reach the Miami-Dade Justice Center at 305-598-4357 or the Broward County line at 954-796-4357. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and until next time, stay safe out there.